Hello, I've got a purring cat here to help us make this last video. This is about interpreting the relative order of geologic events, part 2, in which we're going to be working more on cross-cutting relationships between rock layers, intrusions, faults, etc. The last video in our series dealt with defining the major principles of relative ordering events or relative age dating, and we introduced the principle of cross-cutting or cross-cutting relationships, which states that any feature that cuts across or disturbs rock or sediment layers must have occurred after those rock layers or rock bodies formed. So what kind of events cut or disturb layers? Last time we dealt with tilting and folding and also faulting. This time we're going to focus on intrusions, so igneous rocks or magma intruding into previously existing rock bodies and layers, metamorphism, and erosion. If you cast your mind back to when we worked on igneous rocks and volcanoes, we learned that there's several kinds of rocks that form underneath Earth's surface. They cool relatively slowly. A rock type that does this is granite, so they have relatively large crystals. And these things are called, or these units or bodies that the rock like granite forms in, are known as igneous intrusions because they intrude into previously existing rocks. There's three main types or three main shapes. The sort of general term, it doesn't have any particular defined shape. It's called a pluton. I like to say it has a blob shape. And then there's two shapes that sort of have special, they're special shapes. They're not a big blob, a three-dimensional sort of blob. They're actually more of a sheet that sort of inserts itself in one orientation or another. And it kind of depends on the rock properties. So it might be going into a crack, and it might be going in between pre-existing rock layers. So these two different shapes, if you recall something about this will probably jog your memory. If they're horizontally oriented or along with the rocks that are previously there, that's called a sill. So my connection, the way I remember this, is a windowsill is basically something that's horizontally oriented. If it is not horizontally oriented, it's generally vertical or diagonal compared to pre-existing rock layers, and that's called a dike. So in the next picture, we're going to look at examples of these. Okay, so this is an image from your textbook, a sketch. It's sort of a block diagram. It shows basically the top view and also a couple of different side views, so you really get the three-dimensional aspect of these different kinds of intrusions. So let's start with the pluton. It's a blob or a regularly shaped body. It can connect up with dikes and sills, and commonly does, such as this pipe that we would consider a dike that goes into the volcano, and then we've got a couple other ones more to the right. So blob shaped, irregular shaped, regular, usually pretty large. This is a pluton. In contrast to the blob or irregular shape of a pluton, the sort of sheet-like upward or diagonal bodies that were magma now are igneous rocks, we call those dikes. So we've got two examples here. They're both connected to the pluton. And finally, the sill would be a feature that is like a flat table in shape, and it runs parallel to the rock layers. So we've got a couple of examples here. They're both connected to dikes that sort of shoot the magma up or diagonally first. And then the idea is the magma is under pressure and it's finding any pre-existing weaknesses in the rock. So it might be a fracture, a crack, even a fault, it's possible. And whenever there's a rock layer interface between two rock layers that might be weaker than the surrounding rock, that would be an area where it could form a sill. Eventually, the magma pressure is low enough that it can't really go anymore, and it ends, and so you get these sort of like finger ends of dikes and sills. Another image from your textbook, which lets us ask you, or has an example for you to practice, which type of igneous intrusion is shown here. Hopefully you can see the reddish rock layers, and then sort of going across them from the lower left to the upper right, there's a brownish color rock. It definitely looks different. That's the igneous intrusion. So based on what we just talked about, is this a pluton, a dike, or a sill? And then when you think you've got that figured out, answer this question. When did the igneous intrusion form? Did this happen before or after the red rock layers? So geologists would consider this type of igneous intrusion a dike because it's running diagonally across the rock layers. There's actually a couple of little ones in here too. Probably there was some sort of pre-existing weakness or crack through the rock layers in this orientation and the magma was able to get through. So the question of when did this happen? Because this is considered an intrusion, intrusions always form after the rock layers into which it intrudes. So that is, those rock layers had to be there first for it to be still underground. If they weren't there, probably this would be erupting as a lava flow. And so that word intrusion is a big clue to the fact that this occurred intruding or being sort of poking its way through pre-existing rocks. So there's some consequences of igneous intrusions that can help us understand the relative order of events. So sometimes you can see igneous rock that it could be exposed at the surface of the earth and just gets more sediment put on top of it. That's not usually the case, but there could be a big period of erosion in between. So we look for basically two clues that help us understand what's going on. So this is an image from a different textbook, and we've got a tan rock that's got kind of a wavy pattern to it in this key, and there's an intrusive igneous rock that's sort of a gray or black speckled color. And this is a pluton, if you're curious about what this would be called. So there's sort of two clues or two things that are indicated here. They might be subtle, but there's two clues to what happened, the order of events that geologists would be paying attention to if we're trying to answer the question, which happened first, the tan rock or the igneous intrusion? So take a look for a second and see if you can find some sort of subtle image clues in here, and then I'll tell you what those are that geologists would see. One thing a geologist would note is if you look all the way around that igneous intrusive rock where it touches the tan rock, that it looks like it's a little different color. A little different color is indicated here. It's like a darker brown. So the idea is that intruding magma would tend to bake. It would heat up the surrounding rocks and would tend to metamorphose them. So there would be this little rim or ring of of metamorphic rock that's surrounding the igneous rock if that rock, that tan rock, had been there before the magma intruded into it. So that's one clue we look for, this sort of metamorphic rim or ring. Another thing that geologists would look for is you might notice there are pieces of the tan rock that seem to be incorporated or included into the outside of that igneous intrusion. So that outer sort of area just inside the metamorphic rim, there are chunks of that tan rock. Those are called inclusions. The interpretation a geologist would make is that tan rock must have been there first in order to be sort of broken up and incorporated or included into that younger intrusive rock. So inclusions in general are pieces of older rock that are included in a younger rock. So let's look at this image again and imagine how else we might get inclusions. And this leads us to another important record or event that we can see that's preserved in the rock record, and that really is erosion. So now we're looking at sort of the same diagram, but notice it's sort of faded off at the top. The idea is this has been exposed to weathering, erosion, and that big chunk of that tan rock layer and part of the intrusion has been eroded away. So Weathering and erosion, they tend to produce an irregular surface, but they kind of plane off the surface of whatever we're looking at too. So it's not perfectly flat usually. It's usually indicated in examples or drawings or diagrams. It's sort of an irregular surface. This becomes pertinent when other rock layers are formed on top of that erosion surface. When that happens, we call that erosion surface, once it's buried, an unconformity. An unconformity is basically a break in the pattern of rock layers or rock bodies that aren't necessarily layers, like this igneous intrusion, made by erosion. It could also be lack of deposition, but in this case we know that it's erosion because it's planed off that surface of the pluton that sort of was domed upwards, and now it has a flat top. The other thing we notice here is as weathering and erosion occurred, it produced basically clasts of that igneous intrusion rock. So maybe granite, maybe diorite, something like that. And now those older inclusions are incorporated into a younger bed of sedimentary rock. It's also tan, but it's above our erosion surface or an unconformity. So again, different kind of inclusions, right? Formed by weathering at the surface of the earth in this case, but it's still putting older pieces of rock into a younger rock layer. To summarize, sometimes this is called another principle, like superposition, original horizontality, and cross-cutting. It's called the principle of inclusions. And what it says is younger rock may include pieces of older rocks within it. And as we talked about, the igneous rock could include pieces of surrounding rock if it is an intrusion. And a sedimentary rock could include pieces of the source rock, that is, the rock that was exposed at the surface of the earth and was weathered and eroded. And that both of these occurred in this maybe unlikely scenario here. So this leads us to an important recognition about what we can know about past times on Earth, and that is not all of geologic time is represented by rocks in any area. If we mesh up all the rock layers that we know throughout the Earth, we get a pretty good record. But any particular area, including around Michigan, there's big pieces of time that are missing. And you might guess that has something to do with erosion, and that's the unconformity that we're talking about here. So how do we recognize these? Again, look for rock layers that don't conform, like unconformity, to the pattern of other layers. Look for kind of an irregular surface that is more or less horizontal. So let's take a look at the sequence of events more spaced out from your textbook. So here's the idea. We have at least, I don't know, maybe 12 or so different rock bodies. We have the white speckled thing off to the side, and then we have the rock layers that got folded off to the right. So right now, the surface of the Earth is basically the top of that sequence, or we're not even sure. We don't know exactly how high up the surface is. Maybe we're still underground here. This part of the diagram, or this stage of the diagram, it's a little bit easier to see that we have a surface of the Earth. There's blue sky and there's a cloud there. And I'm going to point out now the erosion surface in red. So this would be basically every place where we have the surface of the Earth that is generally either having sediments deposited or eroding. Not always, but more or less if you see the surface of the Earth, probably there's erosion occurring. If erosion keeps occurring over many thousands or millions of years, which does tend to happen, we could get all the way through the left-hand part of the wavy layers, way down into what looks to be a blob or a pluton. And at that point, it's possible that other sediments and other rock layers like lava flows could be deposited on top of this. And then we would have that erosion surface preserved in between the new layers and the old layers. And that might look something like this. So we've got our old thing we called erosion surface. Now we're calling it unconformity because it is describing this place where there's a big change in the nature of the rock bodies and rock layers. They don't mesh up or match up anymore from below to above that line. So erosion surface in this case has become our unconformity, and we would be able to figure out that it occurred between processes that led to the formation of the lower layers and what happened to make the upper layer. So it's right in between those ages. So the next thing to do is to actually try out ordering some geologic events based on using these principles. So a couple things you should do at this point. You should try the lecture tutorial called Relative Ordering, I believe. There's a link to it further on down in the content section. After you do that, or before if you feel like it, try to figure out the order of events of all the labeled things here in this diagram. This is a fairly complicated diagram, and it's not the easiest thing to figure out right away, so do your best, but this is the kind of diagram you're going to be working with kind of in the lab, so you'll want to give it a try first. You don't have to figure out all the events, but there's 10 things labeled here. The next part of the content, I believe, has some information that will help walk you through why each of these events is ordered the way it is. So you'll want to work through, there's videos, there's a PowerPoint, and there's also some GIFs or GIF sort of time-lapse things that I developed based on the PowerPoint that can walk you through how this worked. So I strongly recommend working your way through this. First, try it without looking at that material, and then go in and correct yourself. Do this before you work on the lab.